For this episode, we're joined by Hera Shakil. Hera, if we could begin, you're the ambassador, one of the ambassadors for Indus Action. If we could begin with your journey into the educational space, can you talk us through that?
Uh, my journey into the educational space was I started as a Teach for India fellow when I was 20, turning 21, right out of undergrad. And I don't think I thought very deeply about that decision. It was, I was graduating from undergrad and I was clueless what I wanted to do next. And this sounded very exciting and sounded like it wasn't like a desk job. It sounded like I would be out there in the world doing things with children. And it just was sort of like an arbitrary decision, but ended up opening this sort of lifelong passion to sort of understand education and how it plays a role in society. Uh, and moving on from Teach for India, where I did 2 years of teaching in a government school right at the borders of New Delhi, in a Bangladeshi refugee community primarily called Jahangirpuri. I felt like I needed some experience to sort of understand the theoretical parts of education and sort of the theoretical uh, uh, functions of education and learning way better than what I knew at that time, and had some previous background in psychology during undergrad. So I went on to do sort of a master's program here in the US, uh, and sort of sort of studied through a whole year how we can use insights from developmental psychology into education policy. And at that time, I was sort of very curious about a couple of things. One was sort of social inclusion, how children from various backgrounds within classrooms and schools sort of negotiate differences and negotiate those intergroup dynamics. And the second thing that I was very curious about was the home base of children and how parenting and sort of early childhood caregiving influences uh, the education trajectory of children. And at that time was I was thinking about these questions, and luckily was also in touch with Tarun, who's the CEO and co-founder of Indus Action, and just thought that that was sort of the perfect place to come back to India and explore those questions through the work that Indus Action was doing. They were doing both kinds of work. One was the affirmative action policy implementation work, and the second was they were also looking at like launching an early childhood intervention for parents within low-income communities who access uh, the, the affirmative action seats through the policy. And then I was there for about 2 years, and it was a really exciting time to be there because the organization was growing rapidly, and there was a lot of sort of blue sky questions that I could ask. And within those 2 years, I instituted sort of an internal research and design component to the organization pertaining to the two questions that I originally was thinking about in grad school. And through sort of the process, I kind of realized that I want to be in academia and I want to pursue research full time, uh, and have all these questions around intergroup relations and how education is a space to navigate intergroup conflict and peace, and sort of conflict between groups of all kinds of nature, including ideological and non-ideological. And then with that sort of thought, moved back here to sort of focus on PhD applications and thinking about sort of life in academia and focusing on these questions more uh, with more sort of rigor and more seriousness. And I'm about to start a PhD in U Chicago in comparative human development department, and I'm primarily interested in sort of how children develop ideological beliefs and how education plays a role in it. So that's one sort of road that I'm interested in, and the other side of those questions is I'm sort of interested in how historical beliefs play a role in intergroup relations and intergroup conflict, and then what does that mean for sort of history education and how history education is sort of manipulated in especially countries where ideological beliefs are a key play a key role in politics.
When it comes to history education, um, peace and conflict, you mentioned as well, and the psychological elements to some of these educational settings. If you could elaborate a little bit on that when it comes to the relationship of those themes to what you understand education to be, what its purpose should be.
Mm-hmm.
Talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I think largely we have like this problem of thinking of education devoid from politics and political sort of implications of educational spaces, which is very untrue. I think children within education spaces are considered citizens in training, uh, and those experiences within classrooms, within school settings and instruction actually sort of plays a huge role in, I think, shaping children's beliefs and attitudes towards outgroup members, their beliefs and attitudes towards democracy, peace and stuff like that. And sort of we kind of tend to take it super lightly in education. I mean, one of the reasons is also that in India we still struggle a lot with sort of imparting basic literacy and numeracy to our students largely. And so the social studies or social aspects of education is sort of something that has taken like a back burner because there are still a lot of rudimentary questions that we need to answer. But given the rise in like right-wing extremism, fascism across the world and in India, we kind of know now that we can't take the links of these political processes to education very lightly, and we cannot say let's figure out how to make our kids read and do math, and then we'll figure out all this civic education, social education stuff later. I think it has to sort of go hand in hand, and like the good thing about that goal of education, that goal of like, you know, shaping beliefs towards sort of justice and towards equity and away from sort of conflict, is it's not dependent on literacy or numeracy in any way. So civic education and democratic education can go hand in hand as and when sort of kids are still learning or struggling with basic literacy or numeracy. uh, I think the other really important aspect to education or purpose to education, especially in India, is it needs to sort of serve the purpose of intergenerational mobility and sort of making things more equitable and societies more equitable. And that access to education has to lead to sort of a poor person being able to like pull themselves out of poverty, irrespective of where they come from, which, because education is so fragmented into private and public spheres, and the quality of education is sort of so different and so inequitable in private and public spheres. uh, Public education in India right now is not really serving that purpose. It's, if you go to sort of a public school in India and finish 12th grade, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a job. You're not, or you're going to be able to pull yourself out of poverty or your family out of poverty. And that, I think, is sort of really important in terms of one of the purposes of education is to sort of make things more equitable. Like if someone has access to quality K-12 education, they should be able to strive to pull themselves out of poverty, which is not happening in India. And sort of the the key to it is that the Indian education is sort of deeply segregated on the basis of class, and that's why I'm such a strong believer in like the affirmative action policy uh, for early grades, which kind of tries to bridge that segregation. So the way it's set up now is like most low income and poor families who do not have options to access private schooling go into the public education system, which has all its issues. And then most families that can afford to pay even little private school fee tend to send their kids to private school. Uh, and because of that, sort of public education has been largely been of extremely poor quality in India till now, and just doesn't serve the purpose of intergenerational mobility and access to pulling oneself out of poverty that education should do. Yeah.
So when it comes to social mobility, democratic education, as you said, cultivating a particular idea of a citizen in those educational spaces, what do you see as the main challenges to bring about these transformations? So you've pointed us in the direction of affirmative action as a potential solution, as a potential way about going around tackling these issues. Are there any other sorts of policies and things that you think need to be introduced in order to bring about these changes?
I mean, I can be really radical and tell you that it one solution which would have sort of like a really messy sort of aftermath probably would be sort of having one system of education, which is not not having probably the private players. I mean, that's a very radical thought. I don't think like in practice it's gonna like happen in India, but I think the key part of it is to sort of bring the public education system at par with private education system, and that can only happen with like supporting the whole ecosystem. We can't just say let's change the books, or we can't just say let's do training for like school leaders. We can't just say let's do training for teachers. Like there are these various parts in the ecosystem, and the whole ecosystem has to be looked as a whole, and intervention needs to happen sort of each level. And I think that's what is going to ultimately lead to sort of more equitable spaces, even in terms of things like democratic education and citizenship education, or sort of just basic cultivating basic beliefs around like justice and equity and privilege, which, I mean, to be honest, not like the private school system is doing a good job of it. If you sort of go ahead and talk to some of, I don't know, my cohort mates from school, and I went to like a private education system, and their beliefs around politics and what kind of politics to support, you'll realize that not that going to a private school sort of makes you more prone to, I don't know, ideas around democratic justice and things like that. So that's sort of a bit that I guess both sectors have to work on, and sort of the equity and intergenerational mobility stuff is something that the public sector has to sort of exclusively work on. And that's only going to happen once we take like this whole ecosystem view and sort of support and make changes at like every level of it, which needs again like huge political will. And going back to sort of my original point that we think that education is sort of devoid of politics, but it's really not. And yeah.
That's brilliant. So this idea then that education is fundamentally political, and that it requires political will to bring about these changes, and we see a lack of that will, or perhaps it's not in their interest of certain political parties to bring about the reform that you're talking about. If the reforms that you talk about were to come into being, what kind of a educational space, what kind of a future society even would you be painting a picture of?
Well, I mean, one picture that probably would be aspirational would be sort of more equitable society. If everyone has equitable access to quality education, there is sort of a chance that this stark inequity that we see in India right now would be slightly bridged. And that sort of, I think, is also tied into like things like people's support for fascism and people's support for intergroup violence and things like that. If everyone's sort of doing better and is sort of benefiting from welfare, like if you consider education part of welfare, I guess people would support. People will stop getting sort of satisfied by this kind of ideological politics and sort of politics towards that's purely based on hatred of others, and sort of demand more and more actionable actual welfare items, I guess. So I guess that's how it's sort of, I see like education playing a role in sort of bringing about like a more just and equitable society, as well as sort of stomping out fascism. If like I don't want to like mask my words about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Bringing these things together, what would your advice be to people that want to be involved in the space, want to be involved in tackling some of the issues that you've raised and bringing about the changes that you think so necessary to bring about? What kinds of things should people do? Whether that be teachers, parents, wider people in society, politicians even. What kind of advice would you be giving to somebody when it comes to actually being constructive about educational reform and action?
Well, my number one sort of very radical advice to people is first sort of sit down and think about your own positioning in this whole scheme of things. Like I mentioned, I think initially that I was 20 years old when I decided that I want to become a Teach for India fellow, and I went into this neighborhood which was largely extremely low income, riddled with all kinds of like intergroup conflict and problems, and sort of started teaching social science, started teaching civics and history, without ever questioning what does my positioning sort of mean in this ecosystem, in this uh, classroom where I'm embedded, in the school where I'm embedded, which is very, very different from anything that I have ever experienced. And what does that sort of mean for my teaching practice, for the way I interact with uh, my kids or their families or other teachers in the ecosystem. So I think my like sort of one biggest advice to anyone who's starting off doing this work is sort of don't be like me and sort of sit with uh, understanding what aspects of your identity have led you to sort of wanting to do this work, and sort of deeply introspect if it's coming from, where is this coming from, and like our ideas of, for the lack of a better word, like colonial notions around sort of intervening and trying to make things better because we inherently somehow feel like we are better. And related to that, like the second piece of advice is sort of listen, like make it like a really participatory journey. Like listen to people that you came in to serve, and listen to sort of hear what their idea of development or what their idea of growth or change is, and sort of have that kind of equal partnership with people that you intend to serve, and irrespective of like where you are in the ecosystem, either you're even if you're like sort of working in public policy, find uh, find ways to sort of put your ears to the ground and listen to the actual people that you want to serve, and sort of understand what they need from this process, and make them sort of equal partners in this process. uh, yeah, I think that's sort of my two bits to like anyone who wants to start off in education or development. Yeah, and be like self-critical about where your ideas and beliefs are coming from. Yeah.